Hey guys, today we are going to be looking at the Civil War's impact on society and social groups. So we are going to start off by looking at African Americans split into enslaved people and then freedmen, which would be a word for, freed slaves. Um, Okay, so because of the Emancipation Proclamation, Black soldiers were actually allowed to enlist in the Union Army, and by the end of the war in 1865, 10% of the Union Army was made up of Black soldiers. So that would be one out of every 10 soldiers. But it's important to recognize that Black soldiers faced discrimination within the Union Army. They were given lower ranks, less pay. They were not as well armed or clothed as their white counterparts. Also, they were put into segregated units. Um, if a black soldier was captured by the Confederacy, they were typically treated worse than white prisoners of war. And then also, they had different jobs within the Union Army. So they had more like labor assignments instead of combat assignments. So, what that means is that they would be doing things like digging trenches or carrying supplies rather than actually fighting in battle. There is an exception to this, though. The Massachusetts 54th Regiment, which was an all black combat regiment, did actually see some combat in 1863. They volunteered to lead the assault on the Confederate Fort Wagner. Here's an image of that. Um, but basically, if you think about it, if you're leading the assault, then you are the first lines to be fired at. And so a lot of this regiment died and basically sacrificed themselves, knowing that there were going to be many deaths in leading this assault. There's a famous movie made about the Massachusetts 54th. It's called Glory with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman and Matthew Broderick. It's really good. It won Oscars. Go watch it at some point. Um, Okay, and then moving throughout the South after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army is freeing slaves. It's emancipating slaves when it comes upon plantations. However, these newly freed people, these freedmen, really don't have anywhere to go because for many of them, all they know is the life on the plantation that they were on. And so, to kind of get them ready for their next step in life, many of these newly freed people were held in what were called contraband camps. The idea behind the word contraband is if you think about like something that you shouldn't have is contraband in the sense that the southerners considered slaves property. Well, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves were property you shouldn't have, so they were called contraband. And so here's an image of a contraband camp up here. A lot of times at these camps, families were, attempted to be reunited. Also, there were eventually some like education procedures put in place to learn how to read and write. And then also, this was a great place for the Union Army to try to recruit soldiers to fight in the army. We'll talk a little bit more about government procedures to try to help a lot of these people start new lives in a later objective. Native Americans, oftentimes people just don't really think about them at all with the Civil War, but they're definitely a big part of the American Civil War. About 23,000 Native Americans fought both sides. Many Native Americans actually preferred the Confederacy, not having anything to do with slavery, but more having to do with the way the Confederacy set up their government. Um, Remember, Native Americans have been mistreated and deceived and abused by the American federal government for so long that they're kind of sick of it. And so they're like, okay, with the Confederacy, they set up a government that doesn't have a lot of power at the federal level. Maybe we'll have more success negotiating with the state governments instead. Um, so here's a picture down here. This was taken, I think, in the 1890s. It's an image of Louisiana Confederate veterans. And then this is actually an image of Eli S. Parker, who was um, a Native American who wrote the document of the surrender terms where the Confederate Army surrendered to the Union Army. And like it says here, he was one of two Native Americans to reach the ranking of brigadier general during the Civil War for the Union side. And women, we kind of talked about women already a little bit, but they were definitely an active and big part of the Civil War. They would sometimes follow their families to the battlefront, whether it was their husband or father or brother or whoever. They could act as nurses, they would do laundry, they would cook. If they stayed back at home, many of them had to fill the male roles. This is a common theme with wars, is that when the men go off to fight, women have to do double duty. So they would run the factories or the family business or the farm while also doing those female gender roles like maintaining the house and raising the children and that kind of thing. Some women disguised themselves as men and enlisted to fight. Here is a really famous image of one right here. Her name was Frances Clayton, and her enlisted name was Jack Williams, and she enlisted alongside her husband. And I think she actually, yeah, down here, she saw her husband killed in battle and continued to fight, basically stepping over his body and continued to fight for the Union. So if you want to like read all the stuff about her, you can just pause the video and read that. It was rare for women to do this, but it definitely happened. And also, women could be spies. They could, pose as a tailor or a laundress or a cook or a nurse or a sex worker or whatever, and then kind of spy on the opposite side and report that back to their home side. Both sides, the North and the South, faced an issue with like a soldier shortage, essentially. And so they both resorted to what's called conscription, which is just a word for the draft, basically forcing citizens to join the military. On both sides, wealthy people could pay to avoid the draft. I know in the Union, basically you could just pay like $300 to the government and then you didn't have to serve. Well, this angers a lot of poor people, especially in the Union, a lot of poor people and a lot of immigrants. A lot of these immigrants are Irish because the potato famine is going on over in Ireland. So there's a huge increase in Irish immigrants to the US, and many of them are poor and being drafted into the Union Army. And we see that this kind of boils over into a riot, these angry sentiments. In July 1863 in New York City, there's a series of 3 days of riots. It's mostly Irish immigrants who are rioting against conscription. And they had several targets that they were kind of attacking. One was free black people living in the North. They lynched them. A lynching is a racially motivated murder because they blamed them for the war. They blamed, the end of slavery for Irish people being drafted into the war. They also would attack Republican Party offices because the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, is the party of kind of leading the war effort. They would attack the home of abolitionists. They believed that freed slaves would be job competition for them in the North, so they didn't really want abolition to happen. And they also just would attack rich people because rich people could avoid the draft. So for 3 days, these riots go on. Many people are left dead. Many property is left destroyed, and it's definitely a really good example of a kind of like resistance to war, especially the draft and the Civil War. There's a quote there at the bottom where it says, "A rich man's war, but a poor man's fight." This kind of is talking about the feelings that many poor and immigrant people felt at the time, where it's the rich people really fighting this war over ideas and politics, but it's the poor people who actually have to fight and die in it. And then conscription or like rioting or disagreements about conscription were definitely not the only disagreements that were happening in the North with the war. There's just a general attitude of dissent, which means disagreement or criticism that many Northern people felt with the war. They were like, it's going on too long, too many people are dying. Just let the South, be the South if they want. And so Lincoln had to face a tough choice, like how do you deal with people who are not supporting the war effort and who possibly could even try to convince more states to secede. And so, one thing that Lincoln isn't really known for that much is his suspension of habeas corpus. So we're going to get into some legal terms for a minute, but I'll explain all of it, and we'll be good to go. So habeas corpus is Latin. It just means have the body. And basically, the Constitution protects you from the government taking your body, like arresting you, without having any evidence and then detaining you without a trial. So if a person feels like this is happening to them, they can file for a writ of habeas corpus where the government has to literally produce your body, produce you in a court, and show that there's evidence for your arrest and you're going to have a trial. All right. So this is in the Constitution right here in Article 1. It says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion of the public safety may require it. So in times of national crisis like a war, sometimes habeas corpus has been suspended or taken away where the government will arrest people without evidence or will hold them without a trial. And the Constitution says that's okay, right? It says, okay, listen, in times of rebellion, like this might have to be suspended. But the thing is here, it's in Article 1, and Article 1 is all about what Congress can do, not what the president can do. And so Lincoln in the Civil War is dealing with a lot of people that are talking trash about the Union and possibly even trying to get states like Maryland to secede. And he really wants to keep those people quiet because he's got to protect Washington, D.C. And so what he does is he issues an executive order to suspend habeas corpus in the border states, basically saying, listen, I can throw any of you guys in jail without having evidence of you doing anything wrong, and I don't have to give you a trial. I can just throw you in jail because I think you're dangerous to the war effort. So during this time, thousands of people were imprisoned. A lot of them were copperheads. Think of a copperhead as like a, it's a snake. It's copperheads have like a sneaky, sketchy reputation, right? They're poisonous. And so these copperheads are people that wanted to compromise with the Confederacy. And Lincoln's like, I got to keep you guys quiet. So he throws a lot of them in jail. And one of these copperheads sues, and he's like, listen, I understand habeas corpus can be suspended. However, only Congress can do it, not the president. And so this leads to a Supreme Court case called Ex parte Merryman in 1861, where the Supreme Court agrees. They say, yes, only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. But Lincoln ignores the Supreme Court and he suspends it anyway without congressional approval. So Lincoln is definitely one of these presidents who's known for using his executive power greatly, but he is always saying, listen, I'm trying to save the country. I'm trying to keep the South from fully seceding and, separating from the United States. That would be his excuse for why he ignored the Constitution or ignored the Supreme Court. This is a famous image. This is the last thing I'll go over. I know these notes are a little bit longer than usual. It's called the Federal Phoenix. A phoenix is a mythical creature that rises from the ashes of burning itself, basically. And every time it burns down and rises, it gains more and more power. And so in this image, you can see that Lincoln is the phoenix, and he's rising from the ashes of the destruction of things like commerce or the economy, the US Constitution, free press, states' rights, habeas corpus, credit, kind of goes back to the economy here. And so there's two ways you can look at this cartoon. You could say it's positive. It's showing like Lincoln getting the necessary powers he needs to continue fighting the war and eventually winning the war. And that might mean that he has to, kind of like break a few eggs or burn a few logs to do that. So it could be positive, but it could also be negative by showing that Lincoln is destroying what makes America unique and what makes America, successful and democratic. He's destroying those things so that he can gain more power to do what he wants. So it really kind of depends on how you feel about Lincoln's actions and how you interpret this cartoon.